Welcome back, guys. We're ready now, having surveyed the 20th century, to begin kind of some analysis of the individual movements that have been showing up on our timeline. We're going to start with Cubism, and I'm going to tell you why. I really want you to see the 20th century as a departure from what had come before, and there really isn't a better work to show that than Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. You could make an argument that you probably should start with Fauvism, like both of our art history books do. But I really want to show you something that departs from the traditional or conventional way of making art that we've seen so far in the course. And I think Picasso makes a bigger argument for that. Now, say what you will about Picasso's personal life and his voracious appetite for women. He's one of those artists that, you love to love the art and hate the artist, primarily because of the way that he treated the women that he knew. But the idea is that we're focusing on this key moment where he has a breakthrough in how you render the world around you. It was a slow process. So while I really did appreciate the Khan Academy video that goes into great detail on how this work was created, I feel like you're owed a little bit more of the process by which he gets to this point in 1907, 1908. So the idea, I've got the image on the left from the MoMA Museum, which it is located in today in New York City. Basically, the picture I got's a little washed out, so I wanted to work with a color that was a little bit sharper. I found online on the right, but it is a crop detail, and I'll come back to this at the end of it to show you something I've just realized looking at the piece. What you have here is a piece we've looked at before, you guys. When we talk about the tradition of the female nude, this is the logical next step, or the maybe by argument illogical next step in the development of that grand tradition. So let's take a look at a young Pablo Picasso, actually Pablo Ruiz Picasso, who used to sign his name with his mother's name in his middle position. The idea basically is that what you had in the young prodigy was a kid who could do basically everything the realists could do. At a very early age, he's able to render things believably, and is able to do it in such a way that the picture on the right earns him admission and scholarship into the Academy in Barcelona to become a painter. But when your submission looks like this, and this is what you were supposed to be taught, you can see he's going to basically get bored in that situation pretty quickly with artists not being able to teach him very much more. So with this work, he's making a claim on the old work that I showed you from Velázquez, that he is like the inheritor of that Spanish great artist. The way that he's making that visual claim is that the lady that you see here in the sick bed, who's being tended by a doctor and a nurse, a nun, basically the length of the bed does the same thing proportion-wise that the horse does the day that I had you guys walk up to the Promethean board and look on either side. He's a master of the same level of perspective and proportion that all the masters are. And basically that makes a strong claim on his ability to be a painter. He leaves the Academy in Barcelona, goes to Paris, and is basically without a pension, without support from home, and becoming very, very quickly drawn to movements in the avant-garde. I've used that word before, and I really want you to understand what that means. The avant-garde, that's a military term. That is the group of people at the front of the army who have the job of plowing into the opposition and making way for the larger battlements that will come behind. They're on the cutting edge. They're pressing forward into new territory. And for a while, it becomes a political term for new ways of thinking about politics. Well, everything is so completely connected at this point that artists begin describing themselves that way as they try to break new ground. Of course, we're looking here at Picasso's work from his blue period. And to connect it to something we've seen before, guys, this is symbolism. where you're not telling a specific story in his work on the left. That's called tragedy. You're not telling a specific life story here with the old guitar player. The blue nude that you see on the right, the qualities of the color carry a sense of melancholy and detachment, and that may have been a reflection of Picasso's life at this time. Some of you are familiar with the fact that his good friend committed suicide because at this point they're just not having any luck getting traction in the art society. After that time, we have the Rose period, where the color palette completely changes. New subject matter makes its way back into his body of work, and many art historians assume that the image of the figure on the left, the Harlequin, is actually a self-portrait of Picasso at the time. The colors have shifted apparently with his mood, but basically we still have this sense of detachment as if we're looking at someone on the outside looking in. This process is going to be something that basically means Picasso will innovate over year after year, picking up something, trying it on for a while, and then passing it off for looking for something else that's even more avant-garde. So I need you to get from this that this was a process. The cubism that you have in the image set is not something that happened overnight. Artists had been trained as academic artists and were looking for ways to innovate art and make it more relevant to its contemporary time. On the left, you can see the view from the Communion, the old guitar player, the cubism. You should know that even with analytical cubism, Picasso is going to go on to other movements as the art world changes. So he's one of those artists who's able to reinvent his vocabulary and stay relevant through his lifetime. So that is why so many people use the G word, genius, with him. He's able to kind of reinterpret his role at that time. Now, this is a portrait that was painted right at about the time that he innovated with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. This is a portrait of Gertrude Stein. And she was an American expat who basically lived in Paris with her brother Leo. The two of them had been born in Philadelphia and were fairly wealthy and affluent, but they were definitely drawn to avant-garde thinking. They enjoyed hosting salons where political thinkers would gather together along with writers and painters, and they would discuss modes of representation for the early 20th century that were really quite liberal and quite avant-garde. Here is Gertrude Stein with the portrait that was painted, and it said that this was her favorite portrait because it showed that Picasso had a breakthrough. He had to sit with her 80 times basically to get this right, and he stopped work on it and picked it back up after seeing an exhibition at a museum that featured African art. He was quite drawn to what many art historians still term primitivism as something that was more pure and more honest than the artwork that he was seeing in the galleries at the time. So he wanted to go for something that in his estimation was more raw and more real in that regard. And that's basically the face that he gives Gertrude Stein. Now, Gertrude Stein is not African or Iberian. She's basically an American, but the face that she has in the portrait is basically a mask, and it's a reductive approach to the features of her face that shows how formidable she is as a thinker and a supporter, as a patron for all the contemporary artists of her time period. So that kind of approach is basically what drives him on to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Now, it's helpful to look at his self-portraits over time and to see how dramatically the styles changed. So I picked four that you can see here, one from about the time he arrives in Paris in 1900, one from his Blue period, one from the Rose period, and one from the time right at the moment that Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is released. And you can see the process is becoming less realistic, more schematic in the way that the figures are rendered or the shapes are rendered. Picasso would say of his artwork that he paints figures not the way they are seen, but the way that he sees them in his mind. and that it was never really the intent to just simply copy nature, because that had been done for 150 years. It was time to innovate and make it more about contemporary life and the speed of contemporary life. So let's talk a little bit more about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Now, you need to know what the title means, and you know from the Khan Academy video that this is not Avignon in France. There's actually a street in Barcelona. It's a red light district street where you would go to brothels and see women that are depicted in the picture. So these are the ladies of Avignon that he knows in Barcelona. There's 5 of them, and you can see they're rendered in different formations, different styles. Some of them staunchly stand in a fixed position, kind of estimating statuesque sculpture from the past. Others are much more voluptuous and kind of entice us into the room. Others look like they're wearing African masks, and they seem to have an aggressive stance and pose and posture. So I have a variety of different styles that are explored. This is a subject that had been done before, so I don't want you thinking Picasso is just like debauched in what he's choosing as subject matter. It's just the way that they'd been rendered before in that first picture by Ong, who we've studied, Le Grand Odalisque, and Delacroix in the bottom, Lady Liberty Leading the People. These are well-known works in the Louvre by those artists that celebrate these exotic and faraway places as something that's, for male meditation. Here, though, Picasso's pushing back against that idea. We know from the size of the piece, if you take a look at this in the MoMA, along with some other images of Picasso's works, that the scale of the thing, it's academic. He meant for this to be kind of like a salvo, like the thing that represents the summation of everything he's done up to this point, as a way to kind of challenge tradition and move the ball down the field a little bit. I was just reading in Stockstad that he may have chosen this size and format because there were some other artists exhibiting exactly the same time. Paul Cézanne had passed away in 1906, and a retrospective of his life was shown in 1907. And the large bathers that I showed you at the end of the Cézanne video, that was on display and would have been like in the minds of people in Paris at the time. His good friend Henri Matisse had just exhibited his large-scale representation of the joy of life. So this may have been like a game between the artists to see if they could come up with the next greatest thing. Here, you may be able to see from the Khan Academy video, this final piece. It had some other members present that were kind of edited out. 2 men were in the collection of females that you see here. One a sailor, the other a medical student, right? And we see that slowly over time they get edited out of the picture, so we're just looking at the female nudes instead. Of course, the estimation that one of them may have been holding a skull, which is a long-standing tradition from the still life, the Vanitas still life, where you consider a skull a memento mori. Picasso may have been musing about, the aspect of you catching something in the brothel, or catching syphilis, or catching something that would lead to your death. So at the same time that you're enjoying life, you're anticipating the end of life. So there may have been additional symbolism here that's not part of the finished work. Ultimately, the females then, if we take a closer look at them, I want to start with the figure on the left. You guys have an image in the image set, Menkaure Chimera Nebti there, and I couldn't help but think of her foot, that large foot at the bottom of your picture being slightly advanced, as being similar to the stance that we've seen from archaic sculpture, whether it be Egyptian or like the Greek Kouros sculptures we've seen. She seems to be the more static and strong figure. Her facial features may have been abstracted from those Iberian sculptures that Picasso was familiar with from his travels all in Spain. When we say the Iberian Peninsula, I'm hoping that you know that means Iberia, which is what the Romans used to call Spain. So we still use that term to talk about that medieval art from that region. And you can see the features do look very similar to the balanced almond-shaped eyes with the elongated nose, almost schematically rendering the human face. I think there has to be a connection here. The females in the middle that are supposedly reclining with their arms and elbows bent behind their heads look like they're ambiguously either laying down on a bed or standing up in front of us. It's very difficult to figure out space in this thing. We'll talk about that in a second, but this is a tradition you should be well familiar with, having seen so many female nudes in the course. This is his rendition or attack on the traditional notions of beauty and trying to make something so angular it's almost off-putting to us. It's more about the composition than it is about believably rendering a figure who's a three-dimensional being sitting in front of us on a two-dimensional canvas. If we shift our focus to the figures on the right, this is where the discussion of primitivism comes in, and we talk literally about these two figures not striking traditional poses. They are aggressive, and there's enough ambiguity about where they are stationed. We don't know if this figure in front is squatting down with a mask on the back of her head, or if Picasso is now trying to show us multiple figures or multiple depictions of the figure at the same time, more in keeping with Cubism. Perhaps we should note that Picasso collected primitive art from Africa. The Khan Academy video made a connection between what's going on in France at the time, what's going on in North Africa. So the idea is there is definitely a conduit of this non-Western art coming into Paris at the time, and many artists are taking notice, not just Picasso. I mean, we've already had Paul Gauguin, and we probably will have others, Matisse, as well as others who use primitive art as something that is somehow more pure than civilized society knew at the time. Of course, you can put these images side by side and you see the abstractions of the face are familiar if you know something about African art. When you look up close at the paint, that's what I wanted you to take a second to notice here. When you look at how it's applied sometimes in flat fields of color where you can barely make out Picasso's strokes. In other places, you see the abrupt like markings where it's almost as if he attacked the canvas, and it creates the illusion of different kinds of textures on that canvas. The abstractions of the face, getting kind of free form with the figure here, seems to kind of suggest that what's more important is the composition that they make rather than the depiction of reality. When you look close, I'm always struck by the flatness of like hands and arms. It's more like making a schematic pattern out of the figure of the body, where you could like make this with like cutouts, right? Or paper cutouts or paper and manipulate them into the same kind of thing. When you look in the background, I do remember that Khan Academy talked about confusing foreground and background. Believable space is not the point of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It is a two-dimensional composition, and Picasso wants to remind you of that. So in much the same way that we had Manet's Olympia and that background pressing forward, we have a hard time finding out if the curtain's in front or if she's in the back or if the background has any depth to it. That's just really not the point of Picasso's representation. It's almost as if reality is not real. And if you take your cues just from what you see on the surface, you miss out on the opportunity to make what you portray more perfect or more interesting than what reality and the everyday will allow. Basically, the idea then, I want to get back to the picture, is this started out talking about this picture in the MoMA, but if you look in the upper corner, do you guys see that some parts of this are not even finished, really? It looks like there's a gray gouache on top of this canvas and the paint's on top of it there for the curtain, but the brush strokes, they don't need to be finished out. It's a modern composition, and that's going to be very, very important moving forward when we talk about process in the 1950s and 60s. You're not making a picture, you're making a composition. And if the balance has been achieved, then you're wasting your time in finishing out the edges or hiding your brush strokes, and you're missing out on the more raw qualities. Of course, in Picasso's idea, look at that hand. the figure that supports herself on the wall. It is gray strikes and pink strikes, and they're not blended in together to give you a three-dimensional feel. So it gives you just a suggestion of how Picasso sees the figure in his mind, and you get just a whiff. You don't get believable reality there. So this is the piece that represents Picasso at the time. I just want to say a word about Cubism, guys. That's a problematic title for this kind of art because immediately you think we're supposed to be seeing a whole bunch of cubes everywhere. And we will see some compositions that look like that. But for me, Picasso's work here looks more like you've taken a cube, you've flattened out all of its six sides, you've cut it apart, and you've started manipulating it back together, but you've also taken the opportunity to cut some of those sides and shift perspective so that some of those things slide against each other in the way that you really manipulate planes and surfaces and textures. So you're going to see more of what I like to call planar manipulation. And I'll just draw out, do you see these triangles in the background? You see these shapes that are blurred in the background. They are geometric interpretations of fabric or silk or coverings of the body that we see inside this brothel, but they're represented in a different texture than, say, flesh and skin. So I think he's trying to give us an indication that that might be folds of fabric, but it's done in such a geometric way, you can already kind of see the analytic cubism that's coming later. Now, Picasso did the same subject here, Ambrose Vollard, who was done by Paul Cézanne a few years earlier. The figure you see on the left, I've talked about before. Cézanne sat with this guy over 80 times as well, and it took a while to get this portrait put together. Vollard was still living at the time of Picasso, and he gets his own treatment. And by this time, you can see what I'm talking about here, planar manipulation. One thing I like about the analytical cubist, guys, is that you always have clues about what they were abstracting from. It's kind of like the figure or the still life or the composition never disappears completely. Abstract expressionism is going to do that, but this is leaving enough of a cue there that we started with a composite picture of the art dealer here, and then over time broke it apart and broke it down into its component pieces. If you look at his head, it's almost like we have the back of the head coming forward as well as the ears that are sticking forward. Sometimes we have duplication of different body parts here, but you get the idea that it's almost the same guy, just later on in life. And I thought that was a really neat comparison, given that Paul Cézanne is often called the master of modern painting. These guys are taking cues from him. When you look at the color palette of what comes up next in analytical cubism, we'll talk about Georges Braque and the Portuguese. If I asked you to tell me the colors that these guys used, the analytical cubist palette is very different than what you saw before with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. They're very different than what you'll see with the Fauves, who are given over to color so much that some people say that they're drunk and mad on color. These guys give color a secondary role. Their thoughts are on analytical form, and how to break it down seems best done without the flourishes of color beyond realist colors, browns and blacks and grays. So you should be able to pick these guys out of a lineup when you see an analytical cubist composition. You'll see much more of them later. In some respects, once you've broken down the entire world, then I guess it's time to build it back up. And that's what we have Picasso doing here on his still life with chair caning. That's actually the seat of a chair. And he took some newspaper and canvas and glued it on top of the chair and has begun to kind of add back things that comprise a still life. Jour disappears there. That's the French word for newspaper, journal. And you see things we expect to see on a table referenced here. Maybe that's a piece of fruit on my right. There's a carafe in the middle of the table. I definitely see a pipe and some other utensils that are going to hold the things I would expect to see in my cafe still life. But this is called synthetic cubism, where you add back the things that you had been breaking down. And eventually artists dispense with that kind of collage approach altogether and start painting this way. This is Picasso's Three Musicians, On the right, you'll see later on Picasso reinvents himself when surrealism becomes a thing. So this just shows you that this kind of thinking about a disaggregated form has a life in a lot of other movements beyond Les Damoiselles d'Avignon. Even in this piece, one of my favorites to talk about with Picasso, Guernica, this is one moment in time where Picasso goes political. And if you know the story of the 1936 Civil War, Spanish Civil War, you know this little town in the Basque North was bombed by the German Luftwaffe as kind of practice for what was coming in World War II. When Picasso read about this event from Paris, he read it in a newspaper, and he wanted to memorialize that moment in time with something that's basically kind of a protest to the entire regime, who was ruthless in their attack on this town on Market Day. There's more to be learned about this piece, which did not return to Spain until Franco was gone. And had been at the MoMA for the longest time, is kind of a testament to the fact that, we have to be careful and cognizant of some of the things that we do. I think it's interesting as a side note here, when it was time to announce that Americans were ready to go into Iraq and attack the oil fields of Saddam Hussein, there's a replica of this work in the UN, and they had to cover it up in order to give the news briefing. So this powerful protest of a bigger country going in on a smaller foe, that was powerful enough in our current time for people to kind of rethink their messaging. So it's definitely worth your time. I've included some videos on the side to show you how this work emerges. If you have the time and you are interested, Guernica won't be something you're disappointed with. So do explore that. But the work in the image set, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, is really the first time that we see those kinds of ideas about fracturing the picture plane. And we're going to talk more about ways people reduced their art to basic principles of form or color. So more on Matisse and the Fauves a little bit later.